In the early morning hours of June 7th, 1992, the quiet town of Springfield, Missouri became home to one of the most baffling mysteries in American history. Sometime between 3 and 7 a.m., 47-year-old Sherrill Levitt, her 19-year-old daughter Suzie Streeter, and Suzie's friend, 18-year-old Stacy McCall, disappeared without a trace from Levitt's home on Delmar Street. There were no signs of forced entry or a struggle. The beds appeared to have been slept in, and none of the neighbors remember seeing or hearing anything out of the ordinary. Even to seasoned investigators, it seemed as though the women had simply vanished into thin air. For more than 30 years, police and amateur sleuths alike have worked to solve the disappearance of the Springfield Three. Yet we seem no closer to finding the missing women than on the day they vanished. So I want to begin by running through a timeline of the events leading up to the disappearances. We'll start with Stacy and Suzie because their day is better documented and honestly just more eventful. And then we'll briefly discuss what little we know about Sherrill Levitt's day. The story begins on June 6, 1992, graduation day at Kickapoo High School in Springfield, Missouri. Stacy and Suzie had a trip to Whitewater planned for the following day in nearby Branson. So their plan, after graduation, was to attend a few parties throughout the evening before driving to Branson and staying the night in a hotel. Though, as we'll see, very little that night went according to plan. The graduation ceremonies ended at 6 p.m. From there, the girls went back to their homes to spend time with family, to pack, and to get ready for the evening. They met back up at Janelle Kirby's home in Battlefield at around 8:15 and walked just up the street to the first party of the evening at Brian Joy's place. Now, as the night went on, they eventually decided just to wait until the morning to make the trip to Branson. And initially, Brian had invited them to stay the night, but depending on the source, he either rescinded this offer or the girls changed their minds. Either way, we know that Stacy placed a call to her mother at around 10:30 to tell her she'd be staying the night with Janelle and to promise to call the next morning before leaving for Whitewater. About an hour later, the girls rode with Brian to a second party in Springfield, this one hosted by classmate Michelle Elder. They stayed until shortly after 1 a.m. when a noise complaint brought the police. They then drove back to Janelle's place, intending to go to bed. However, their plans were disrupted once again. You see, the Kirby house was crowded with relatives who were in town for Janelle's graduation, so there wasn't room for Stacy and Suzie to comfortably sleep over. This forced the two girls to drive back to Springfield to crash at Suzie's place. The last confirmed sighting of the girls was around 2:15, leaving Janelle's house in separate vehicles. Now, Sherrill's day was much simpler. We know that she attended the graduation at the Hammond Student Center. Afterwards, she ordered pizza and spent time at home with her daughter until Suzie left for the party. Sherrill spent the rest of the evening painting a chest of drawers and refinishing a chair for her bedroom. She and Suzie had only recently moved into the home on Delmar Street, and Sherrill was constantly doing various home improvement tasks. Around 11:15, she had a brief conversation with a friend over the phone. And this is the last time she was heard from. Probably, but we'll get to that. The next morning, Janelle Kirby was expecting a call from Stacy to tell her when she should leave for Whitewater. Obviously, the call never came. And after multiple failed attempts to contact the girls throughout the morning, Janelle and her boyfriend Mike decided to drive to Suzie's home, thinking maybe they had either slept in or even left without them. They arrived at the Levitt home around 9 a.m. to find all three vehicles parked in the Circle Drive. As they approached the house, they noticed glass from a broken light fixture strewn across the front porch. Mike, believing he was being helpful, swept the glass up and emptied it into a bin across the street, potentially destroying crucial evidence in the process. After clearing the glass from the porch, the couple knocked repeatedly to no response. Eventually, they discovered the door was unlocked and just let themselves in. Now, they didn't stay long, but they didn't notice anything particularly troubling either. Remember, they weren't thinking a crime had been committed at this point. This was the early 90s, a time before cell phones and constant contact with friends and family. The assumption was that they had either left with someone else or just walked up the street and would return shortly. Before leaving, however, the phone rang. Hoping it was Stacy or Suzie, Janelle answered. On the other end was a male voice saying some very disturbing, sexually suggestive things. So Janelle hung up. This repeated a couple of times until Janelle just let the calls go to the answering machine. But even after this, Janelle and Mike still didn't think anything was wrong. Now, they received a lot of criticism for this over the years, but it's important to remember that prank calls were fairly common in the 90s, and that's all they figured these were. Soon after, the two left the home and drove back to Janelle's place. Now, it was around 11 a.m. at this point, and Janice McCall still hadn't heard from her daughter. Remember, when she spoke with Stacy the previous night, Stacy had promised to call before leaving for Whitewater. So Janice called Janelle's place where she expected her daughter to be. Now, Janelle hadn't returned from her trip to Suzie's yet, so Janice spoke with her mother instead. This is when she learned that Stacy hadn't stayed at their place and had instead left with Suzie. Over the next few hours, Janice placed a number of calls to Suzie's, trying and failing to get a hold of her daughter. But at this point, she was more angry than frightened. She assumed Stacy had just changed plans without telling her and would either call her back or come home. Now, later that evening, Janice finally decided to drive to Suzie's place. The only problem was that she didn't actually know where Suzie lived, so before she could find her daughter, she had to track Janelle to a local water park to get the address. But because of these delays, it was between 8 and 9 p.m. before she finally arrived at Delmar Street. And to a worried mother, the scene was much more concerning. The TVs had been left on, and Sherrill's dog Cinnamon was visibly upset. All three of their purses were lined up at the top of the stairs. Their keys, jewelry, medications, and even $900 in cash belonging to Sherrill had all been left behind. In Suzie's bedroom, Janice found the outfit her daughter had worn for the graduation ceremony, as well as her bikini and flowered shorts, which were laid out for her trip. Janice also listened to the message Janelle had sent to voicemail. It was apparently the same man saying the same vile things. But unfortunately, in the process of playing the message, she accidentally deleted it. Janice was convinced now that something was seriously wrong. In fact, she didn't even bother going home and instead called the police from the Levitt home. The first officer on the scene was Rick Bookout. But by the time he arrived, numerous people had been inside the home, a situation which isn't ideal for a potential crime scene. Between the glass being disposed of, the deleted voicemail, items moved around, and fingerprints left by concerned friends and family, much of the evidence had been contaminated before an investigation could even begin. Now, it wasn't until the next day that police were able to obtain a search warrant, but they did take an initial look around the house. They saw no signs of a struggle, that is, no blood or broken items apart from the light fixture, but they thought the scene was strange enough to suspect foul play. The cash and jewelry in the house seemed to rule out a robbery. The beds had been slept in, the hamper contained makeup-smeared washcloths, and there was clothing laid out for the next day. To an investigator, it looked as though the women may have been the victims of an abduction shortly after going to sleep. Now, as they left the home for the night, officers placed a note on the door instructing Sherrill and the girls to call the police and cancel the missing persons report if they arrived home. Of course, they never did. Without any immediate suspects or promising leads, police mostly relied on the public for help. Over the next few weeks, investigators pursued hundreds of tips and conducted searches throughout Springfield and the surrounding area. Within days of the disappearances, the FBI were brought onto the case, and investigators were confident the added resources would help in the recovery of the missing women. Meanwhile, the victims' families and citizens of Springfield did their part. More than 20,000 missing posters were placed throughout the city in storefronts and along public sidewalks. Nearly everyone within 50 miles of Springfield was familiar with the women's faces. Unfortunately, the optimism soon gave way to frustration as lead after lead failed to bring investigators closer to the truth. Now, a full accounting of the investigation would be impossible. Police have been searching for these women for 3 decades at this point. So I've decided to construct a timeline of what I think are the most relevant and intriguing portions of the investigation. We'll begin on June 7th, the day of the disappearances. A waitress at George's Steakhouse claimed to have seen the 3 women sometime between the hours of 1 and 3 a.m. She says the women were accompanied by 3 men and that Suzie appeared to be drunk. Now, the steakhouse was less than a mile from Sherrill's home, and it's plausible that the girls were hungry after a night out. Most of us have been there at one time or another. But still, police think this tip is likely a case of mistaken identity, mostly because the waitress in question only claims to have seen the women, not waited on them. It seems like their server would be the most reliable witness, but when questioned, not one employee remembered taking an order from or even speaking with the 3 women that night. Now, nearly a week later, on June 12th, divers searched Springfield Lake and a portion of the James River, but again found nothing of use to the investigation. That same day, a strange letter in a sealed envelope was left at a local grocery store. It contained a hand-drawn image of a local apartment complex, as well as a cryptic message which read, quote, "Use ruse of gas man checking for leak." Police searched the apartments but found nothing, and as best they could tell, the bizarre message was unrelated to the missing women. 2 days later, a woman came forward to tell police she had seen a man near Sherrill's house multiple times in the days before the disappearance. The woman described the man as being in his early 30s with dark hair and a mustache. Police created a sketch of the man, which was circulated to the public. But unfortunately, the woman was unable to identify him in a lineup, so it's impossible to know whether he was involved in the case or just a guy out for a walk. The following day, a picture of a green van was issued to the public. A neighbor of Sherrill and Suzie's reported that a green Dodge van, being driven by a blonde woman, had pulled into her driveway 2 days after the disappearance. She claims there was a man issuing orders from the back seat, and that she heard him say, quote, "Don't do anything stupid." When shown a picture of Suzie, the woman identified her as the driver. The police took the information seriously enough that they purchased a similar van and parked it outside the police department with the number for the tip line on the side. However, this likely did more harm than good to the investigation, as the public suddenly started seeing suspicious-looking vans of all different colors across Springfield and the surrounding areas. Now, one of the more interesting tips involved a gas station attendant named Steve Thompson. According to Thompson, all 3 women came into the gas station the night of the disappearance. He claims Suzie and Stacy arrived in separate vehicles and that Stacy was with a man in his early 30s with dark stringy hair and a mustache, features resembling the sketch recently released by police. Thompson claims to have overheard the girls talking about meeting up later before leaving in opposite directions, Stacy with the unknown male.
Suzie and Stacy and another girl that I don't recall ever seeing were in there earlier in the evening. I'm not sure on the time. It could be anywhere from 10 to 11, 11:30, somewhere in between there.
They buy something?
They came in and each bought like gum, candy, and then there's a guy that was with Stacy, and he stuck his head in and said he had forgotten to buy cigarettes, and Suzie then purchased some Marlboro Lights for him.
Sherrill, he claims, entered the store a bit later, around 2:15 a.m., and asked if he had seen her daughter and friend.
Stuck her head in. She asked if I had seen 3 girls. And I said, hold on just a second. And I finished taking the money from the customer, and then I walked around the counter to the door, and she asked if I had seen Suzie, a brunette girl, and another blonde girl in the last hour and a half to 2 hours.
But while all of this sounds compelling, the friends who were with Stacy and Suzie that night all claim they never stopped at that gas station. So basically it's one guy's word against that of every other available witness. So investigators never took the account too seriously. And as far as the description matching the sketch, remember, the sketch had been circulated widely by local news at this point. Anyone in the area who either watched a newscast or bought a paper would have been familiar with it. So unfortunately, this really doesn't tell us much. Now, the final tip I want to discuss is easily the most controversial. It's from an anonymous source who claimed the women were buried under the south parking complex at Cox Hospital. Now, police have discounted this tip as baseless, but the theory has gained popular support over the years through the efforts of a local reporter named Kathy Baird. Baird, believing there may be something to the rumor, hired a ground-penetrating radar expert to conduct a scan of the area. The expert, Rick Norland, found 3 anomalies at the site which he claims are consistent with a gravesite. Public demands to dig the site up have persisted for years. There's even an online petition with well over 2,000 signatures. However, there are good reasons the police have never acted on this information. First, according to investigators, the initial source of the tip was a psychic who failed to provide any evidence that the women were buried in that location. But more importantly, construction on the parking structure didn't even begin until September of '93, over a year after the disappearances. The killer, or killers, would have had to store the bodies for all that time until they could dump them at the hospital. So, despite public pressure, the police's position is that there's just not enough evidence to justify spending the thousands of dollars it would require to dig up the garage. Now, you may have noticed a trend here. The investigation really didn't yield much of value. But I want to stress that this isn't the fault of the police. There just doesn't seem to have been any evidence to be found, which means whoever did this either got incredibly lucky or planned extremely well. So, people don't just vanish into thin air. Of course, there are those who speculate alien abduction might have been involved, but being serious, it seems likely that someone harmed the women in some way. But who? Who could take 3 women in the dead of night without a struggle and without leaving behind a shred of evidence? Well, since the disappearances, a wide range of suspects have been considered, from family members to exes to even serial killers who were active around the time. The problem they all share, however, is a lack of evidence tying them to the crime. So one guess is largely as good as the next. Still, there are suspects who were more seriously considered by police than others, and those are the ones we'll be discussing. Among the earliest suspects police looked at was Bart Streeter, Sherrill's son and Susie's brother. Bart was estranged from the family due in part to struggles with alcohol abuse, but had recently returned to Springfield with hopes of mending things with his mother and sister. Bart was mostly considered because a family member's involvement might explain why there's no evidence of a struggle or forced entry. But I want to stress that there's never been any real evidence against him. Bart was fully vetted and eventually cleared by police. He had a solid alibi for the night in question and cooperated fully with investigators. And for what it's worth, he even passed a polygraph test relating to the disappearances. Now, some people have pointed to his later troubles with the law, including public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and attempted false imprisonment, as evidence of his guilt. But it's hard to blame someone who's had to deal with not only the loss of his mother and sister, but with years of suspicion of his involvement for acting out, particularly when he already suffered from substance abuse issues beforehand. So, for these reasons, Bart isn't generally considered among the more likely suspects. The next group of model citizens, on the other hand, were considered very strongly by police. They are Susie's ex-boyfriend, Dustin Rekla, and his two friends, Michael Clay and Joseph Rydell. In February of 1992, just a couple months before the disappearances, the three were arrested for breaking into a mausoleum and stealing gold fillings from a corpse. Yeah, classy fellas. Suzie had recently broken up with Rekla and had given a statement about the crime to police. It was likely she would have had to testify against the three in court. To many, this is a clear motive for murder. But there are good reasons to doubt their involvement. For one, Suzie wasn't the star witness. She only knew what Rekla had told her. The important testimony came from Joseph Rydell, one of the three grave robbers who agreed to testify in exchange for a plea deal. Susie's testimony would have only served to corroborate Rydell's story, but this proved unnecessary as the three were convicted without Susie's involvement. Second, it's hard to believe three men who got caught vandalizing a graveyard could make three women disappear without a trace. And really, murder just seems a bit drastic considering the circumstances. They were charged with vandalism, not murder or drug running. And it certainly couldn't have been about the money. The three got 26 grams of gold from their caper, which sold for around $30 at a local pawn shop. Creepy, sure, but hardly the crime of the century. So what reason could they possibly have to add murder to such relatively minor offenses? Honestly, the three strike me more as delinquents than hardened criminals. Now, when none of the family members or close acquaintances of the women looked promising, the police moved on to local violent offenders with a history of similar crimes. And it turns out that there were a few in the area who fit the bill. The first of these men, and I use that term very loosely, we'll look at is Steve Garrison. Garrison is currently serving 40 years in prison for the brutal sexual assault of a 20-year-old college student just a year after the disappearances. The details of that crime are too horrific to recount here. But if you absolutely must know, there are vivid descriptions of the incident available online. That said, I'd recommend just taking my word that it was really bad and that Steve Garrison is a monster. Garrison had been arrested for an unrelated offense, and in an effort to sweeten his plea bargain, he told investigators that he had information concerning the Springfield Three. According to Garrison, he overheard a friend confess to the murders while at a party. Supposedly, he provided information that wasn't public knowledge, so the police thought he could be telling the truth. Garrison claimed the women's bodies could be found on a farm in Webster County. Police obtained a search warrant for the property, but the bodies were never located. and whatever was found is unfortunately protected under a gag order. So, despite his big talk, his tips provided police with absolutely nothing. Investigators have never cleared Garrison, but they have since backed off him as a likely suspect. Now, a lot of people are naturally curious about what could have been found that needed to be suppressed by a gag order. It's a fair question. However, I'll add that a local journalist named Robert Keyes, who was on site during the search, claims nothing relevant was found. So we can really only speculate. The next suspect, Robert Cox, is considered by many to be the most likely of the available options. Cox was a former Army Ranger who was convicted of the brutal 1978 murder of Sharon Zellers. That conviction was later overturned by the Florida Supreme Court, but the circumstantial evidence was compelling. By his own admission, his travel that night placed him in the victim's path. Zellers' body was found less than 400 feet from his motel, and oh yeah, he came in that night covered in blood from a severed tongue. In addition, Cox's alibi fell apart under scrutiny. He claimed to have accidentally bitten his tongue during a fight at a local skating rink, but security guards at the rink said no such fight occurred. Police were able to verify that he was at the skating rink, but Cox was unable to account for more than an hour of his time after leaving. Now, he claims to have gotten lost before returning to the skating rink, where a random stranger found him and gave him a ride home. Conveniently, this Good Samaritan was never located, and no blood was found in Cox's vehicle, despite him supposedly driving around with a severed tongue all night. In contrast, there was a trail of blood at the Days Inn where he was staying, all the way to his room on the 3rd floor. There was also blood found in Sharon's vehicle, and while DNA testing didn't exist at the time, the blood type was a match for Cox. Lastly, it's worth noting that the skating rink was right next to the grocery store Zeller frequently stopped at for cigarettes on her way home from work. So, all things considered, I'd say it's understandable why a jury voted to convict Cox. And they weren't the only one. Cox would later serve 9 years for the kidnapping and assault of a young woman in California, and he remains the primary suspect in several assaults, robberies, and even other murders. Of course, all this really tells us is that Cox is a violent scumbag. What, you're probably wondering, is the connection to the Springfield Three? Well, only weeks before the women went missing, Robert Cox moved to Springfield, where he took a job at a local car lot owned by Stu McCall, Stacy's father. Now, he was no longer working for Stu at the time of the disappearance, but he would eventually claim to know what happened to the women. In 1996, he was interviewed from prison by KY3 reporter Dennis Graves, and he made some very troubling remarks. Quote, "I know they are dead. I'll say that, and I know that." When Graves asked whether this was just a theory, Cox responded, quote, "I know that they are dead. That's not my theory. I just know that. There's no doubt about that." Naturally, police were very interested in Cox, but he appeared to have an alibi. He claimed to have been with his family the night of the disappearances and with his girlfriend the following morning. And initially, his girlfriend corroborated his story, but she later recanted and admitted Cox had asked her to lie for him. So investigators have never been able to determine his whereabouts for the night of the 6th or the morning of the 7th. Still, there's no actual evidence linking him to the crime, and Cox refuses to speak further about the case until his mother dies, which is weird in itself. And while it's certainly interesting that he once worked for Stacy's father, police have found no evidence that the two ever actually met, It's certainly possible Stacy did occasionally visit her father at work. There's just no evidence of a meeting, or that Cox even knew Stacy existed. As you can probably tell, of all the commonly discussed suspects, I lean towards Cox. His history of violence against young women and his connection to Stacy are difficult to ignore. But without evidence, it's just impossible to draw strong conclusions at this point. So I debated about where to discuss this last part, or even if I should. There's really no suspect involved, and it's not exactly part of the investigation either. I'm honestly not even sure if it's worth mentioning given the source. But it's an interesting story that has gained a good deal of attention over the years, so make of it what you will. Okay, so in 2012, an anonymous poster on Kathy Baird's blog, I know, claimed to have witnessed what could have been the murder of the three women at the Girl Scout camp at Camp Winoka. According to the mystery writer, he was 15 years old at the time, visiting family in Springfield. He claims that late on the night of the 6th, he and his friend Chuck snuck out to visit the campsite, which was a popular hangout for students at the time. According to the post, around 4 a.m., he and Chuck were deep in the woods near an old campground when a van pulled up. The two hid and watched the events that unfolded from about 50 yards away. Due to the blinding headlights, they could only make out vague shapes and shadows, but they could tell that 3 men and 3 women got out of the van and that the women were begging for their lives. The rest, he says, he didn't need to see to understand. According to the post, one of the women was killed almost immediately. The other 2 were then brutally beaten and sexually assaulted before being loaded, either dead or unconscious, he couldn't be sure, back into the van. The boys waited until the vehicle pulled away before leaving their hiding spot and walking home. The poster claims that the events he witnessed that night have haunted him for decades. Chuck, he says, was so distraught that he took his own life within the year. Now, there's a little more to the tale, but that's the basic idea. If you want to read it for yourself, I'll leave a link to it below. Now, what to think of the story? To be honest, I don't think much of it. It is very likely a hoax. Though, in fairness, there are people who think it could be legitimate. The most common argument I hear in its favor is that the poster never actually claimed he could identify the women. If it were a hoax, why not go all the way and claim it was definitely the Springfield Three? To some, this adds an air of believability to the post. We also know that the authorities are aware of the post. When asked about it, prosecutor Daryl Moore called the account interesting. Of course, we have no way of knowing what that means, but it's certainly more than the immediate dismissal I would have expected. But despite this, I have serious doubts about the poster's authenticity. If he had seen what he claims, why wouldn't he or his friend have come forward? I certainly understand a child being afraid, but after he came to terms with his experience later in life, he never thought to pick up the phone and call the police? Even after he learned about the missing women? I just don't buy it. Now, I've seen some people suggest that he's worried he wouldn't be believed. But if he came forward, investigators could at least determine whether he had family living in Springfield at the time. It wouldn't prove his claims, but it would establish some credibility at least. It's also suspicious that the one person who could corroborate what he claims to have seen that night just happens to be dead. And if Chuck was so distraught that he eventually took his own life, why wouldn't he have reached out to someone? Not a parent or friend or teacher? It just seems like a stretch. And as far as him not identifying the women, I agree that it adds more believability to the story, which is exactly why I suspect he wrote it that way. It was likely a clever attempt to make the story stick out amongst the countless other online theories, and it worked. So initially, I planned for this to be the part where I tell you what I think happened. But the more I thought about it, the less comfortable I was going that route. The sad truth is that there just doesn't seem to be enough evidence to draw any strong conclusions. And I think that's what makes this case so frustrating. Of course, with any cold case, you expect significant gaps in the evidence. But with this case, there doesn't seem to be any evidence at all. So, instead of telling you what I think, I've decided to leave you with the words of prosecutor Daryl Moore.
I have judges and lawyers, when they find out who I am, ask me, what's the inside scoop? They think I have an inside scoop on who did it, and I have to tell them, I don't know. Nobody knows. No one has an inside scoop. I think we all, in our own minds, some of us have thoughts about this person may have done it, won't be able to prove it, but they had a good motive. But in terms of having any real solid indicator, no. And I think that's still what disturbs people.